Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Hub. Today's story is one of my favorites.
At 53, I thought I had my life figured out. Senior partner at Morrison and Associates, corner office with a view of the city skyline, and a reputation for being the lawyer other lawyers feared. My days were predictable. Black coffee at 6 a.m., briefs by 7, court by 9, and home to my pristine condo by 8 p.m. Rinse and repeat for 30 years. But that Tuesday night in March, something shifted. Maybe it was the bottle of wine I'd opened after winning the Henderson case. Or maybe it was the way the city lights looked particularly lonely from my window. Whatever it was, I found myself downloading that dating app my paralegal had been pestering me about for months. It's not just for 20-somethings, Faith, she'd said. There are actual adults on there. So there I was, creating a profile like some desperate divorcee. Except I wasn't divorced, I was something far more complicated. I was a woman who'd spent 3 decades convincing herself she was straight, who'd dated men with the same methodical approach I used for case preparation, who'd never married because I could never quite make myself say I do to someone whose touch felt like performing a role. The first few matches were exactly what I expected. Recently divorced men looking for someone to iron their shirts and listen to their stories about ungrateful ex-wives. Delete, delete, delete. Then Julia's profile popped up. Julia James, 48, art director. The photo showed a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun, paint-stained fingers holding a coffee cup, and eyes that seemed to be laughing at some private joke. Her bio read, "Too old for games, too young for bingo. Looking for someone who can appreciate both vintage wine and terrible reality TV." Before I could overthink it, I swiped right. She matched immediately. Her first message made my heart skip. So, a lawyer who doesn't believe in marriage. Is this where I say objection? I stared at my phone for a full minute before typing back, "Overruled, try harder." And God, did she try harder. For 2 weeks, we exchanged messages that ranged from playfully flirtatious to surprisingly deep. She told me about her ex-husband who left her for his secretary, a cliche. So painful, it circled back to being almost funny. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, how I'd built my career as armor against a world that felt hostile. To women like me, how I'd convinced myself that being alone was the same as being strong. Julia wrote back, "Strength isn't isolation, counselor. Sometimes it's letting someone else hold you up." That message sat in my phone for 3 days. I'd read it during depositions, between court appearances, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Finally, she sent another, "Enough texting, meet me, coffee tomorrow." I'll be the one not wearing sensible shoes. The cafe she chose was everything. I usually avoided exposed brick, mismatched furniture, and a menu that listed at least 12 different types of milk alternatives. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a plain black coffee, and sat at a corner table where I could watch the door. When Julia walked in, the air in the room seemed to shift. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are and not apologizing for it. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the afternoon light, and she wore a linen blazer over dark jeans and true to her word red heels that made her legs look like they went on for miles. "Counselor," she said, extending a hand. "You're late," I replied, but I was smiling. "I'm fashionably late." There's a difference. When our hands touched, I felt something I'd convinced myself was just a myth, that electric spark you read about in romance novels. My breath caught, and from the way Julia's pupils dilated slightly, I knew she felt it too. We talked for 3 hours. About her work designing book covers, about my latest case involving a woman fighting for custody of her children. She made me laugh with stories about her impossible clients, and I found myself sharing war stories from the courtroom that I'd never told anyone. You know what I noticed about you? She said as we walked to our cars. What? You use your career like a shield. Every time I ask something personal, you deflect with a case study or a legal anecdote. I stopped walking. It's not a criticism, she said softly. I'm just saying, you don't have to be a lawyer with me. You can just be Faith. I didn't know how to respond to that. I'd been Faith the lawyer for so long, I wasn't sure who just Faith was anymore. One coffee date became three. Then dinner. Then Julia invited me to her house for what she called a poolside relaxation session, which I quickly learned was code for I'm going to get you drunk and ask about your deepest fears. Her backyard was a small oasis in the middle of the city. String lights hung between trees, and the pool reflected the purple twilight sky. She'd made margaritas good ones, not the sugary mixes I expected. So, she said, settling into the lounge chair next to mine, why really never married? I took a large sip of my drink, hoping the tequila would make this conversation easier. I told you, busy winning cases. Liar. She turned to face me fully. You were scared. The word hung in the air between us. I wanted to deny it, to deflect. With another work story, but something in her eyes made me want to tell the truth. My firm in the 90s had a no gays policy, I said quietly. Not officially, of course, but everyone knew. There was this associate, Rebecca Martinez. Brilliant lawyer, made partner track in record time. Then someone saw her at a gay bar. She was asked to resign the next Monday. Julia's hand found mine. Faith. I buried that part of me so deep, I forgot how to dig it up. I dated men because it was expected. I convinced myself I was just picky, that I had high standards. But the truth is, I was terrified of wanting something I couldn't have. And now, I looked at her then really looked. The way the lights reflected in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the way she held my hand like it was something precious. Now I'm terrified of wanting something I can have. She leaned closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral that made me think of spring mornings. Let me help you remember, she whispered. When she kissed me, it tasted like tequila and lime and 30 years of suppressed desires finally finding their voice. I'd been kissed before, of course, but never like this. Never with my whole body awakening to something I'd convinced myself I didn't need. When we finally broke apart, I was shaking. Stay tonight, she said. I did. The next few weeks felt like living in a dream. Julia and I fell into an easy rhythm dinner at her place. Long walks through the city, lazy Sunday mornings that stretched into afternoon. She was teaching me how to paint, claiming that everyone needed a creative outlet. I was terrible at it, but I loved watching her hands move across the canvas, the way she bit her lip when she concentrated. I was happy. Genuinely, completely. Happy for the first time in years. Then the universe decided to test that happiness. I was in the middle of a deposition when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but there's a Julia James here. To see you. She says it's urgent. I excused myself and found Julia in the lobby, pacing back and forth in agitation. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. They demoted me, she said without preamble. Sighed. I'm too old to relate to Gen Z and that they need fresh perspectives on their campaigns. The anger that rose in me was swift and sharp. Give me names. Wait, you'd represent me. I looked at her like she'd grown a second head. Honey, I'm not just representing you. I'm burying them. And I meant it. Julia had been at her company for 15 years. She'd won awards, brought in major clients, mentored junior designers. To push her aside because of her age was not just cruel, it was illegal. I threw myself into the case with the kind of focused intensity that had made my reputation. Secret recordings of sexist executives, documented evidence of age discrimination, a paper trail that painted a picture of systemic bias. Julia wrote a viral op-ed titled, "Ageism is the New Sexism," that was shared thousands of times across social media. 3 weeks later, Julia was not only reinstated, but promoted. With a significant settlement and a very public apology from the company, victory tasted sweet until my phone rang. "We don't appreciate drama, Faith," said Martin Morrison, the firm's founding partner. "Clean out your desk." 30 years gone. I sat in Julia's kitchen at 3 a.m., working my way through a bottle of whiskey and trying to process what had happened. I'd been so focused on fighting for Julia that I'd ignored the warning signs at my own firm. The disapproving looks, the way conversation stopped when I entered a room, the subtle isolation that had been building for weeks. 30 years, I said, raising my glass in a mock toast. Gone. Julia sat across from me, her eyes fierce with anger on my behalf. "Then start your own firm. One that actually fights for people like us," I laughed bitterly. "With what money? What clients?" "I'm 53 years old, Julia. I'm not starting over." "Why not?" She leaned forward. "You're brilliant. You're experienced. You have a reputation for winning impossible cases. The only thing stopping you is fear." "Fear of what?" "Of being who you really are." The words hung in the air between us. I thought about all the cases I'd wanted to take but couldn't because they weren't firm appropriate. The LGBTQ clients I'd watched go to other lawyers because Morrison and Associates had a reputation for being old school. The women who needed fierce representation but couldn't afford our rates. "We'd need a name," I said finally. Julia's smile was radiant. "How about Silver and Sapphic?" I laughed despite myself. "That's terrible. It's perfect. Own who you are, Faith. Own who we are." She stood up and walked around the table to where I was sitting. When she kissed me, it tasted like possibility and second chances. "I love you," she said against my lips. "I love you too," I replied, and meant it with every cell in my body. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of legal filings, office hunting, and learning how to be a small business owner. I rented a modest space in a converted warehouse, hired 2 young associates who'd been overlooked by bigger firms, and hung out my shingle. Faith Morrison, attorney at law, specializing in employment discrimination, LGBTQ rights, and women's issues. My first client was a transgender woman who'd been fired from her teaching job. The case was complicated, emotional, and exactly the kind of fight I'd been itching for my entire career. Julia helped me design my business cards, paint the office walls, and sat through countless evenings of me practicing opening statements. She was building her own business too, a freelance design consultancy that let her work with clients who shared her values. "Look at us," she said one evening as we painted my office walls a warm shade of blue. "A couple of rebels starting over at 50. "Speak for yourself," I replied. "I'm still 49. She laughed and kissed my paint-stained cheek. "I love your vanity. It's not vanity, it's strategic marketing." But we both knew the truth. I was finally comfortable in my own skin, age and all. 6 months later, I was in the middle of a particularly difficult custody case when Julia walked into my office with a bouquet of sunflowers and a nervous smile. "I know you're busy," she said, "but I need to ask you something." I looked up from my brief, noting the way her hands were shaking slightly. "What is it?" She set the flowers on my desk and dropped to one knee. "Faith Morrison, you are the most stubborn, brilliant, infuriating woman I have ever met. You've changed my life in ways I never expected. You've taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. So, dot, dot, dot. She pulled out a small velvet box. Will you marry me? The ring was perfect, a simple solitaire that caught the light streaming through my office windows. I stared at it for a long moment, thinking about all the times I'd said I didn't believe in marriage, all the years I'd convinced myself I was better off alone. Yes, I said, and the word felt like coming home. Not everyone was thrilled about our engagement. Julia's sister, Margaret, had always been conservative, but I hadn't expected her reaction to be quite so hostile. It's not natural, she said during a tense family dinner. You're both old enough to know better. Know better than what? Julia asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Than being happy? Then this dot 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 phase. You were married to David for 20 years. You have a daughter. This is just what, Margaret? Attention seeking. A midlife crisis. Julia stood up abruptly. We're leaving. In the car, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, I'm sorry. I thought she'd come around. Family's complicated, I replied, taking her hand. My parents died thinking I was just a career woman who never found the right man. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you us the most are the ones who can't see us clearly. Do you regret it, not having kids? I thought about it seriously. I regret not knowing myself well enough to make conscious choices, but regret having this life with you? Never. She squeezed my hand. Margaret's not coming to the wedding. Then she's missing out on the party of the century. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received a cease and desist letter from my former firm. They claimed I was improperly soliciting their clients and engaging in unfair competition. It was a transparent attempt to intimidate me, but it still stung. Julia found me in my office at midnight, staring at the letter. They're trying to destroy what we've built, I said. Are they succeeding? I looked around my office, the walls, covered with thank you notes from clients, the photos of victories, the framed news articles about cases I'd won. In 6 months, I'd built something that felt more meaningful than my entire career at Morrison and Associates. No, I said finally, they're just making me more determined. Julia smiled and pulled me to my feet. Then let's go home and plan our wedding. We have a party to throw. The wedding was everything I'd never let myself dream of. We chose a small vineyard outside the city, strung lights between the grapevines, and invited 50 of our closest friends and chosen family. Julia's daughter, Emma, flew in from Portland and cried during the entire ceremony. My former paralegal officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for our wedding. I wore a navy blue suit that Julia had helped me pick out. She wore a flowing cream dress that made her look like a goddess. We'd written our own vows, but when the moment came, I found myself going off script. Julia, I said, my voice shaking slightly. For 30 years, I lived my life in careful, measured steps. I built walls instead of bridges. I chose safety over authenticity. Then you walked into that coffee shop in those ridiculous red heels and turned my world upside down. The crowd laughed, and I saw Julia wiping away tears. You taught me that love isn't just for the young, that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply be happy. When it was her turn, Julia said, Faith, you are my unexpected gift, my second chance at a life I never knew I wanted. You've shown me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself, to stand up not just for what you believe in, but for who you are. The kiss that sealed our marriage tasted like champagne and promise, and the sweet relief of finally being home. The honeymoon was a week in Italy, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. We wandered through art galleries, drank wine in tiny trattorias, and made love with the patience of people who'd found each other at exactly the right time. I used to think I was too old for grand gestures, Julia said as we sat on our hotel. balcony watching the sunset over Florence. And now? Now, I think I was just waiting for the right person to make them with. When we returned home, my law practice was thriving. Word had spread about the lawyer who'd left a prestigious firm to fight for the underdog. My calendar was booked solid with cases that mattered employment discrimination, LGBTQ plus rights, women fighting for custody of their children. Julia's business was growing too. She'd been hired to design the marketing materials for a campaign supporting marriage equality in a neighboring state. We were both busier than ever, but it felt different now. Purposeful. Like we were building something together that was bigger than either of us alone. 1 year later, I stood in my office, looking at the wall of photos and news clippings that chronicled the cases I'd won. The transgender teacher had gotten her job back. The woman fighting for custody had won full parental rights. The couple denied service at a bakery had received a settlement that made national news. Julia walked in with 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair across from my desk. "Penny for your thoughts," I gestured to the wall. "Just thinking about the journey, how different things might have been if I'd been braver earlier." Or, she said, "How perfect the timing was. Maybe you needed to be exactly who you were when we met. Maybe I needed to be divorced and starting over. Maybe our love story is better because we had to wait for it." I considered this. You think everything happens for a reason? I think everything happens and we get to choose what meaning to make of it. We chose to see our meeting as fate. We chose to build something beautiful together. We chose love over fear. She was right, of course. The woman I'd been at 30 wouldn't have been ready for Julia. I'd needed those years of building my career, of learning who I was professionally before I could figure out who I was personally. "No regrets?" I asked. "Only one," she said with a smile. "I regret that it took us so long to find each other." 6 months later, I was cleaning out my desk when I found a letter Julia had written me during those early days of our relationship. It was tucked inside a legal file, forgotten until now. "My dearest Faith," it began, "I know you think you're too old for love letters, but I'm writing this anyway because some things need to be said on paper in permanent ink, so they can't be taken back or forgotten. You asked me once what I saw in you. You said you were too old, too set in your ways, too afraid of change. But here's what I see. I see a woman who spent 30 years building armor around her heart and then had the courage to take it off. I see someone who could have stayed safe and comfortable and chose to risk everything for love. I see the way you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. I see the way you make me laugh when I'm taking myself too seriously. I see the way you touch me like I'm something precious, something worth protecting. You think you're starting over, but I think you're finally starting. This isn't the end of your story, my love. It's the beginning of the chapter you were always meant to write. All my love, Julia." I read the letter 3 times, then walked to Julia's studio where she was working on a new painting. "I found something," I said, showing her the letter. She looked up, paint smudged on her cheek. "Oh, that old thing. I was so sentimental in those days." "Were you right?" "About what?" "About it being the beginning of the chapter one was always meant to write." She set down her brush and pulled me into her arms. "What do you think?" I looked around her studio at the paintings that covered every wall, at the photos of us scattered across her desk, at the life we'd built together in defiance of everyone who said we were too old for grand gestures. "I think," I said, "that the best stories are the ones that begin with, 'I never expected this to happen.'" She kissed me then, and it still tasted like possibility, like second chances and new beginnings in the radical act of choosing love over fear. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy. Somewhere other women were swiping right on dating apps, taking chances on coffee dates, learning that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. But in Julia's studio, surrounded by the evidence of our unexpected love, I knew something that had taken me 53 years to learn. The most beautiful chapters often begin after the world tells you the story's over. Love isn't just for the young. Sometimes it finds you when you've stopped looking, when you've convinced yourself it's too late, when you're certain that happiness is something that happens to other people. But here's the secret. Darling, the secret I learned in red heels and coffee shops and late night conversations about second chances. The best love stories are the ones that begin with the courage to be yourself, completely and unapologetically, even when the world tells you it's too late, especially then.